October 23, 1987. The Rambo 3 set in British Columbia fell silent when the prop gun fired live rounds. Silvester Stallone hit the ground, blood spreading across his shoulder. Panic erupted, except for Frank Castellano. Frank moved like a machine. Pressure point. Tourniquet. Battlefield triage in 45 seconds. The crew watched a stuntman perform trauma surgery with the precision of a Green Beret medic. Stallone looked up at Frank's steady hands, saw something in those eyes that didn't belong on a movie set. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered. That's when Frank realized his cover was blown. Someone had loaded live rounds on purpose. Someone knew Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano was supposed to be dead. The question wasn't who wanted to kill Stallone, the question was who wanted to expose Frank. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Frank's hands never trembled as he worked, muscle memory guiding each movement while his mind calculated variables that had nothing to do with Stallone's wound. The blood was already clotting, a through-and-through clean entry and exit. The actor would live, but Frank might not see morning. "Get the medics!" Someone screamed behind him, but Frank had already shifted into damage control mode. Not for Stallone, for himself. Already called, he lied smoothly, his voice carrying the authority that made people obey without question. "ETA 12 minutes. Keep everyone back." Stallone's eyes remained locked on Frank's face, studying him with the intensity of a man who'd spent years reading people for roles. "That's not stunt coordinator training," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "First aid course," Frank replied, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. First aid courses didn't teach you to locate and compress the subclavian artery in under 3 seconds. They didn't teach you to assess ballistic trauma with a glance or to jury-rig a pressure bandage from a torn t-shirt that would hold until real surgeons took over. The crew buzzed around them like agitated hornets. Director Peter MacDonald pushed through the crowd, his face pale. "Jesus Christ, Frank, what happened?" The props were checked twice. Frank didn't answer. Instead, he scanned faces, camera operators, grips, extras, catering staff. 47 people on set today. Any one of them could have swapped the blanks for live rounds. But whoever had done it wasn't trying to kill Stallone randomly. This was surgical, calculated. Someone had waited until the exact moment when Frank would be forced to reveal skills that Francis Castellano had died to bury. "The gun," Frank said to MacDonald, jerking his chin toward the Colt. "45 lying 3 feet away. Don't let anyone touch it." "Of course not. We need to preserve—" "Not for the investigation." Frank's voice dropped low enough that only MacDonald and Stallone could hear. "Because whoever loaded it might want to clean up their evidence." Stallone's eyes sharpened. "You think this was intentional?" Frank met his gaze. In 12 years of coordinating stunts, he'd built a reputation for being unflappable, methodical, almost boring in his attention to safety protocols. Now he could see Stallone reassessing everything he thought he knew about the man kneeling over him. "Props don't just malfunction like that," Frank said. "Not on my sets." The distant wail of sirens grew louder. Frank's window was closing fast. Once the paramedics arrived, once the police started asking questions about his background, his expertise, his unnaturally calm handling of a shooting, the carefully constructed identity of Frank Castellano would crumble like tissue paper. He'd been Francis Castellano for the first 26 years of his life. Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano, 1st Special Forces Group, trained in combat medicine, small unit tactics, and keeping his mouth shut about operations that officially never happened. He'd been Frank Castellano, Hollywood stunt coordinator, for exactly 12 years, long enough to almost believe the lie himself. "Sir?" A young grip, Tommy something, approached hesitantly. "The police are here. They want to talk to whoever was in charge of the firearms." Frank nodded without looking away from Stallone's shoulder. "Tell them 5 minutes." As Tommy hurried off, Frank caught something in his peripheral vision. A figure moving against the flow of the crowd, heading away from the set instead of toward the commotion. Average height, dark jacket, baseball cap pulled low. Nothing remarkable except the timing. "I need you to listen carefully," Frank said to Stallone, his voice barely audible. "When they question you, stick to the facts. The gun went off, you went down, I helped until the medics arrived. Nothing about my competence level." "Why?" Frank finally looked away from the wound, meeting Stallone's eyes directly. What the actor saw there made him go very still. "Because Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano died in a helicopter crash in Cambodia 12 years ago. And certain people need him to stay dead." Stallone was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "How certain people?" "The kind who load live rounds into prop guns to flush out ghosts." The sirens were close now, maybe 2 minutes out. Frank made his decision. He pulled a business card from his wallet. Not his usual stunt coordinator card, but one he'd hoped never to use. Plain white, no company logo, just a phone number written in pencil. "If anything happens to me," he pressed it into Stallone's good hand, "call that number. Ask for Checkpoint Charlie. Tell them Francis says the Mekong remembers." Before Stallone could respond, Frank stood and walked toward the approaching police cars. 12 years of hiding were about to end. The only question was whether he'd live long enough to find out why. Introduction. The police interview lasted 43 minutes. Frank had counted every second, measuring time the way he'd learned in places where 30 seconds could mean the difference between extraction and execution. Detective Maria Santos asked the predictable questions. When had he last checked the weapon? Who had access to the props? Did he have any enemies on set? And Frank gave her the expected answers. Professional, cooperative, concerned. She didn't ask about the battlefield dressing technique he'd used on Stallone, or why his hands had remained perfectly steady while everyone else fell apart. Small mercies. "We'll need you to stay available," Santos said, closing her notebook. "This is going to be a media circus." Stallone getting shot on a movie set? Every reporter in LA is already calling. "Of course." Frank shook her hand, noting the callus on her trigger finger. "Ex-military, probably Marines based on her posture. Whatever you need." But as he walked back to his truck in the studio parking lot, Frank wasn't thinking about reporters or investigations. He was thinking about Elena. Elena Vasquez lived in a small house in Burbank with yellow roses climbing the fence and wind chimes that sang in 3 different keys when the Santa Ana winds blew through the valley. She worked as a seamstress for Western Costume Company, her fingers creating magic with fabric and thread, transforming actors into cowboys and soldiers and kings. She hummed while she worked, old Mexican lullabies her grandmother had taught her, and she made coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Frank had met her 18 months ago when she'd been hired to repair a Civil War uniform that had been shredded during a particularly enthusiastic battle scene. He'd brought the costume to her shop expecting a simple transaction, but Elena had looked at the torn fabric like it was a wounded animal that needed healing. Her concentration had been absolute, reverent almost, as she'd examined every ripped seam and missing button. "This uniform," she'd said without looking up, "it tells a story. Someone wore this into battle thinking of home, thinking of people they loved. The least I can do is put it back together with the same care." That's when Frank had known he was in trouble. Now, as he drove through the canyon roads toward her house, Frank's hands finally began to shake. Not from the shooting. He'd processed that kind of violence decades ago, but from the certainty that after tonight, he might never see Elena's smile again, never taste her coffee, never fall asleep to the sound of her breathing beside him. The sun was setting behind the Hollywood Hills, painting the sky the color of old blood. Frank parked outside Elena's house and sat in the truck for a moment, memorizing details. The way the porch light caught the silver threads in her wind chimes, the sound of her television through the open window. She always watched the evening news while she worked. The scent of jasmine blooming in her garden, sweet and heavy in the evening air. He'd told Elena he was a stunt coordinator who'd grown up in Cleveland, that his parents were dead, no siblings, no complicated history. She knew he had nightmares sometimes, thrashing, sweating episodes that left him hollow-eyed in the morning, but she'd never pressed for explanations. Elena understood that some stories took time to tell. Now, there would be no time. Frank climbed out of the truck and walked up the path he'd traveled dozens of times. Past the roses Elena's mother had planted before she died, past the small statue of St. Francis that watched over the garden. The patron saint of animals and lost souls. Elena had laughed when she'd pointed out they shared a name, but Frank had seen the way she touched the statue's head for luck. He knocked softly, 2 quick taps followed by 3 slower ones, their private signal, and heard Elena's footsteps approaching. When she opened the door, her face lit up with the smile that had been anchoring him to the world for 18 months. "Frank, I wasn't expecting you until—" She stopped, reading something in his expression. Her hand moved instinctively to the saint's medal she wore around her neck, a nervous habit Frank had noticed when she was worried. "What's wrong? Can I come in?" She stepped aside, and Frank entered the living room that had become more home to him than anywhere he'd lived since Vietnam. Elena's sewing machine sat in the corner, surrounded by carefully organized spools of thread in every color imaginable. A half-finished wedding dress hung from a dress form near the window, ivory silk that caught the last rays of sunlight like captured moonbeams. "There was an accident on set today," Frank said. "Stallone was shot. He's going to be fine," he added quickly, seeing Elena's eyes widen. "But the police are investigating, and there might be complications." Elena moved closer, her small hands reaching for his. "What kind of complications?" Frank looked down at their joined hands, her fingers small and precise from years of detailed work, his scarred from countless fights and mistakes. He wanted to memorize the feel of her touch, store it away against the darkness he could feel approaching, the kind where I might have to go away for a while. Elena's fingers tightened around his. "Frank, you're scaring me. What aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, the phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet room like a blade, sharp and insistent. Elena glanced toward the kitchen where her yellow rotary phone sat on the counter, then back at Frank's face. "Let it ring," he said, but something cold was already spreading through his chest. Nobody called Elena's house looking for him. Nobody even knew he came here. The phone rang again. 3 times. 4. "It might be important," Elena said, starting to pull away, but Frank's grip tightened. "Elena, don't." 5 rings. 6. Then silence. Frank exhaled slowly, but the relief lasted only seconds before the phone started ringing again. This time it didn't stop. 7 rings. 8. 9. "Madre de Dios," Elena whispered, crossing herself. "Something's wrong." Frank released her hands and followed her into the kitchen, every instinct screaming danger. Elena reached for the receiver, but Frank caught her wrist. "Let me answer it." "Frank, this is my house. Please." Something in his voice made her step back. Frank lifted the receiver, his free hand already calculating distances, to the back door, to the drawer where Elena kept her carving knives, to the window that faced the alley. "Hello?" Silence. Then breathing, deliberate and measured. "Francis." The voice hit him like shrapnel, tearing through 12 years of carefully constructed lies. Colonel Marcus Webb, older now, rougher around the edges but unmistakable. Frank's commanding officer in the Phoenix program, the man who'd ordered him into the Mekong Delta in 1975, the man who'd left him for dead when the mission went sideways. "You have the wrong number," Frank said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Impressive field medicine today, though a bit flashy for someone who's supposed to be dead. Webb's laugh was like glass breaking. "Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano, missing in action March 15, 1975. Posthumous Bronze Star. Very touching ceremony." "I gave the eulogy myself." Frank turned his back to Elena, lowering his voice. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted, Francis. Your silence." But today's little performance has created complications. People are asking questions about Frank Castellano's background, about his training, about how a stunt coordinator knows combat medicine. Nobody saw anything unusual. Silvester Stallone saw, the crew saw. Most importantly, certain members of Congress are asking very uncomfortable questions about Phoenix program survivors, questions about war crimes, about operations that never officially existed. Frank's reflection stared back at him from the kitchen window. A man caught between 2 names, 2 lives, 2 different kinds of death. Behind him, he could see Elena standing in the doorway, her face pale with growing understanding that whatever was happening, it was bigger than an accident on a movie set. "The operation in Cambodia," Frank began. "Never happened," Webb cut him off. "Just like Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano never existed." But if certain people start digging into Frank Castellano's past, they might find inconvenient connections. They might discover that a dead war hero has been living quietly in Hollywood, keeping secrets that could bring down senators, generals, and defense contractors. Frank's reflection wavered as his breath fogged the glass. You loaded that gun. I prefer to think of it as a field test. You passed, by the way. Still have those excellent reflexes. Still can't resist playing hero. Webb's voice turned cold. But heroes have a way of dying young, Francis. Especially heroes who know too much. What do you want? Frank repeated. Tomorrow morning, you're going to discover that your girlfriend's immigration status is problematic. Seems there are discrepancies in her paperwork, questions about how she really got to this country. Elena Vasquez could find herself deported very quickly, unless she has someone with influence looking out for her. Frank's blood turned to ice. He looked at Elena, who was twisting her saint's medal between nervous fingers, and felt something break inside his chest. Webb had done his homework. He knew exactly where to apply pressure. You touch her. I don't need to touch her, Francis. I just need you to remember who you really are. Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano died in Cambodia because he saw things he shouldn't have seen. Frank Castellano needs to die in Los Angeles before he says things he shouldn't say. The line went dead. Frank stood frozen with the receiver in his hand, listening to the dial tone while his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. 12 years of Frank Castellano, the boring stunt coordinator, the reliable craftsman, the man who deserved Elena's love, evaporated like morning fog. When he finally turned around, Elena was watching him with dark eyes that had seen enough heartbreak to recognize it in someone else's face. That wasn't about a movie set accident, she said quietly. Frank hung up the phone and looked at the woman who had become his anchor, his redemption, his reason for believing that Francis Castellano's sins might someday be forgiven. No, he said, it wasn't. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening air drifting through the open window. Who was that man? Why did he call you Francis? Frank moved away from the phone, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Webb hadn't made idle threats in Vietnam, and 12 years hadn't made him any less dangerous. If anything, time had given him more resources, more connections, more ways to destroy what little Frank had managed to build. I need you to pack a bag, Frank said, avoiding her question. Just essentials. We can stay at... No. Elena's voice cut through his planning like a blade. I'm not running from shadows, Frank. Not until you tell me what's happening. Frank looked at her standing in the kitchen doorway, backlit by the warm glow of her sewing room, and felt the familiar weight of choosing between truth and protection. He'd spent 30 years learning that the two rarely coexisted. The man on the phone, we served together, a long time ago. In Vietnam? Frank nodded, surprised she'd guessed. He'd never told her about his military service, but Elena had sharp eyes. She'd probably noticed the way he moved, the way he checked exits, the way certain sounds made him go rigid in the middle of the night. What does he want? For me to disappear. Elena stepped closer, her dark eyes searching his face. And if you don't? Frank's silence was answer enough. She crossed herself again, lips moving in what might have been prayer. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear he could see building behind her eyes. This is about more than an old soldier looking for his friend. Elena. My first husband was killed by men who wanted him to stay quiet about things he saw at the factory. Men who made phone calls in the middle of the night and knew things about our family they shouldn't have known. Her hand moved to her saint's medal, worrying the small silver disc between her fingers. I know what dangerous silence sounds like. Frank felt something crack open in his chest. Elena had never spoken about her first husband's death, beyond saying it had been an accident. Now he understood why she'd recognized the weight in his nightmares, why she'd never pushed for stories he wasn't ready to tell. This is different, he said. These people, they have reach, government connections. They can make problems with paperwork, with immigration status. So they've already done their research. Elena's laugh held no humor. Of course. They know I came here with tourist visa that expired 6 years ago. They know I've been working without proper documentation, sending money to my mother in Guadalajara. She shrugged with forced casualness. They know everything they need to hurt you. Frank moved toward her, but she held up a hand. No more lies, Frank. Not after tonight. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived loss before. Who are you really? And who is Francis? The kitchen clock ticked into the growing silence. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and Frank could hear the evening news continuing its cheerful recitation of the day's tragedies from the living room television. Normal sounds from a normal world that felt suddenly very far away. Francis Castellano died 12 years ago, Frank said finally. Officially, but not really. No, not really. Elena absorbed this, her seamstress fingers still working the saint's metal like rosary beads. And Frank Castellano is a man who wanted to forget what Francis saw, what Francis did. Frank's voice dropped lower. What Francis failed to do. And now this man, your former commander, he wants to remind you. Frank nodded, watching Elena's face for signs of fear, disgust, the moment she'd realized that 18 months of loving Frank Castellano had been 18 months of loving a ghost. Instead, she moved closer. "Show me," she said quietly. "Elena." Your hands are shaking. You keep looking at the windows like you're expecting someone to come through them. You're planning escape routes. Her dark eyes never left his face. "This isn't the first time you've had to run, is it?" Frank's hands were indeed shaking, had been since Webb's voice had torn through 12 years of careful burial. Elena reached out and captured them in her smaller ones, her touch warm and steady. "I've been Frank Castellano for 12 years, he said. "Longer than I was ever, Francis. I thought Frank was real." "Frank is real," Elena said fiercely. "The man who brings me coffee every Sunday morning is real. The man who fixed my porch light and learned to dance to my grandmother's records is real." She squeezed his hands tighter. "But Francis is real too, and he's in trouble." The phone rang again. This time, neither of them moved to answer it. The ringing stretched between them like a taut wire, each chime marking seconds that felt like hours. Frank counted. 12 rings, 13, 14, before the silence returned, heavier now, loaded with implications. "How many people have you killed, Francis?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Elena's voice remained steady, but her grip on his hands had loosened, and Frank felt the first hairline crack in the foundation he'd built with her. "Elena, the way you moved today, when Stallone was shot. Detective Santos told me you applied pressure to the wound before the paramedics could even reach him, that you knew exactly where to check for arterial damage." Her dark eyes searched his face. "That's not stunt coordinator training." Frank pulled his hands free, moving to the window where he could see the street. A sedan he didn't recognize sat parked under the broken streetlight 3 houses down. "Could be nothing, could be everything. 37, he said without turning around. The number hung in the air between them like smoke. Frank had never said it out loud before, but he'd carried the count for 12 years, adding and subtracting as memories shifted and clarified. 37 confirmed kills in operations that officially never existed, for a government that had publicly disavowed the methods even as they demanded the results. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Elena whispered, and Frank heard her cross herself again. Some were combat, clean kills, enemy soldiers who were shooting back. Frank's reflection stared back at him from the window, a stranger's face carrying a dead man's confessions. Others were different. The Phoenix program. It wasn't a question. Frank spun around, shock replacing calculation. Elena stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her saint's metal catching the kitchen light like a small shield against the darkness they were discussing. "How do you—" "My cousin Miguel. He was in the army, stationed in Saigon until 1973. He came home talking about shadow operations, about soldiers who didn't exist hunting Viet Cong sympathizers through the villages." Elena's voice carried old pain, family stories shared in whispers. "He said they called themselves Phoenix. He said they did things that weren't supposed to happen in a war America was supposed to be leaving." Frank felt the walls closing in, not just the physical walls of Elena's kitchen, but the carefully constructed barriers he'd built around Francis Castellano's memories. Webb's phone call had cracked the dam. Now Elena's questions were washing away what remained. "Miguel killed himself in 1976, Elena continued quietly. Drove his car into the Rio Grande outside Laredo. The family said it was an accident, but I saw his letters home. I read about the nightmares, the drinking, the way he couldn't touch his own children without thinking about the children he'd seen killed in villages whose names he couldn't pronounce. The sedan under the broken streetlight started its engine. Frank moved away from the window, his mind cataloging weapons. Elena's carving knives in the drawer, the tire iron in his truck, the .38 he kept taped under the sink in his own apartment 15 minutes away. "We need to leave," he said. "Not until you tell me about Cambodia." Frank stopped moving. Elena stood between him and the back door, her small frame suddenly immovable as stone. She'd heard Webb mention Cambodia during the phone call. Nothing got past the woman who could spot a loose thread in a wedding dress from across a crowded shop. "Elena, there's no time. There's never time for the truth, is there, Francis? That's how men like you stay buried. Always one more crisis, one more emergency, one more reason to keep running instead of standing still long enough to be held accountable." The words cut deeper than Frank had expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. He'd been running since March 15, 1975, the day Staff Sergeant Francis Castellano had walked into a Cambodian village following intelligence that proved to be catastrophically wrong. "You want to know about Cambodia?" Frank's voice turned harsh, military sharp. "We were hunting a Khmer Rouge coordinator named Sofol. Intelligence said he was running weapons through a village called Prey No Kor, that he was using civilians as cover for moving supplies to cells operating across the border." Elena didn't flinch from his tone, didn't step back when his voice carried the edge that had once ordered men into kill zones. "Webb sent my team in during the dry season, when the rivers were low and extraction would be clean. Supposed to be simple: locate Sofol, eliminate the weapons cache, extract with minimal civilian exposure." Frank's hands began shaking again, but this time Elena didn't move to steady them. The village had 63 people, old men, women, children. No weapons cache, no Khmer Rouge coordinator. The kitchen clock ticked into the silence. Outside, Frank could hear the sedan's engine idling, waiting. But we'd already been seen, already compromised the mission. Webb gave the order to sanitize the area. Frank's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "To eliminate witnesses." Elena's face went pale, but she didn't look away. "I refused the order," Frank continued. "Told my team to stand down. That's when Webb pulled his sidearm and shot my point man in the head. Said anyone who couldn't follow orders was compromised too." The phone started ringing again, but neither of them moved. "How many?" Elena asked. "All of them." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Frank watched Elena's face cycle through disbelief, horror, and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "You killed 63 civilians," she said, her voice flat as winter sky. "No." Frank's response came too quick, too desperate. "I saved them. I got them out through the rice paddies while Webb was calling for backup. Lost 2 more of my own men doing it, but the villagers escaped." Elena's laugh was bitter, foreign. Nothing like the warm sound that usually filled her kitchen during their Sunday mornings together. "Listen to yourself, Francis. Listen to what you're not saying. I'm telling you the truth. You're telling yourself the truth you need to survive." Elena moved closer, her dark eyes boring into his. "You saved the villagers. You lost your men. You were the hero who stood up to the bad commander." Her voice grew harder. "But that's not why you've been running for 12 years, is it?" Frank felt something cold crawling up his spine. The sedan outside had gone quiet, but he could feel eyes watching the house, calculating angles and distances just as he was. "You want to know what my cousin Miguel wrote in his last letter?" Elena continued. "He said the worst part wasn't the killing. It was how easy the lying became afterward. How you could convince yourself that the children were reaching for weapons, that the old women were signaling enemy positions, that every dead civilian was really a disguised Viet Cong fighter. That's not," he said. "Phoenix operatives got so good at rewriting their own stories that they could pass polygraph tests while describing massacres as rescue operations." The kitchen suddenly felt airless. Frank's carefully constructed narrative, the one he'd been telling himself for 12 years, began crumbling like sand. Elena stepped closer, and he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she'd told him about during one of their lazy Sunday conversations. All the tiny intimacies that made Frank Castellano real. How many villagers actually escaped, Francis? His mouth opened, but no sound came. In his mind he could see them, the 63 faces from Pré Nocourt. But now, under Elena's relentless gaze, the memory shifted like water. The rice paddies, where he'd led them to safety, suddenly looked different. The helicopter evacuation that had lifted them to freedom became something else entirely. How many? Elena repeated. Frank's voice broke. I remember leading them out. I remember the evacuation. You remember what you needed to remember. Elena's hand moved to her saint's medal, but her touch was gentle now, sad rather than angry. Miguel wrote about that too, how the mind protects itself by changing the story. How you can witness yourself committing atrocities and transform them into acts of heroism even as they're happening. The phone had stopped ringing. The silence felt ominous, pregnant with approaching violence. Webb shot my point man, Frank whispered, grasping for the one solid detail in the dissolving memory. Jenkins. He shot Jenkins for refusing orders. Did he? Or did you shoot Jenkins to show the others what happened to soldiers who wouldn't follow orders? The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Suddenly he was back in the Cambodian village, feeling the weight of his sidearm, watching his own hand move as if controlled by someone else. Jenkins turning to him with confused, trusting eyes, the crack of gunfire that might have come from his own weapon. No. But even as Frank said it, Webb's voice echoed from the phone call. Still can't resist playing hero. The mockery in those words suddenly made terrible sense. Elena was watching him with the expression she wore when examining damaged fabric, looking for tears that could be mended, and tears that meant the whole garment was ruined. You weren't the hero who stood up to Webb, she said quietly. You were Webb's most reliable killer. That's why you're still alive when your whole team is dead. That's why he's calling now instead of just having you shot. Frank's legs nearly gave out. He caught himself against the kitchen counter, his reflection in the window showing him the face of a stranger. Not Frank Castellano, the steady stuntman who deserved love. Not Francis Castellano, the tragic hero who died trying to save innocence. Someone else entirely. He needs you to remember who you really are, Elena continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd loved liars before. Not the fantasy Francis who saved villagers, but the real Francis who eliminated witnesses. Because somewhere out there, someone's asking questions about Cambodia, and Webb needs his best killer to make sure those questions stop. Outside, car doors slammed shut. Heavy footsteps approached the front porch. Webb's voice drifted through the darkness. Time to come home, Francis. Frank's hand moved instinctively toward the kitchen drawer where Elena kept her carving knives, muscle memory overriding 12 years of careful civilian conditioning. But Elena caught his wrist, her seamstress fingers surprisingly strong. No, she whispered, not in my house. Webb's footsteps circled the porch like a predator testing boundaries. Frank counted at least 2 other sets of boots. Backup, positioned at the corners where escape routes narrowed into kill zones. Professional spacing, military precision. Francis Webb's voice carried the patient authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I know you're listening. We need to talk. Elena's grip tightened on Frank's wrist. In the kitchen light, he could see the pulse jumping in her throat, rapid and bird-like. But her voice remained steady when she spoke. Is this how it ends? You remember who you really are and become that person again? Frank stared at her. This woman who'd spent 18 months loving a ghost, who'd just watched him crumble into something monstrous and hadn't run. The kitchen around them felt sacred suddenly. Her grandmother's cross on the wall, the coffee cup still sitting in the sink from this morning's breakfast, the small domestic altar they'd built together without realizing it. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know who I really am anymore. That's the point. Elena released his wrist, but didn't step away. He's not here to kill you, Francis. He's here to give you back your real face, the one you've been hiding from. A sharp knock rattled the front door. 3 precise raps, then silence. Elena Vasquez, Webb called out, and Frank's blood turned to ice water. Born in Guadalajara, 1952, arrived in Los Angeles on a tourist visa, July 1981, currently employed at Martinez Bridal on Sunset Boulevard, despite lacking proper work authorization. Elena's hand moved to her saint's medal, but her feet stayed planted. He's done his homework. Your mother Maria still lives at 447 Calle Hidalgo. Your sister Carmen works at the American consulate in Mexico City. Webb's voice carried the casual precision of someone reading from a file. Funny how visa applications can get lost in bureaucratic shuffles. How workplace raids can target specific establishments. Frank felt the familiar weight of other people's safety pressing down on him. This was Webb's specialty, finding the pressure points that made good people do terrible things. Family, home, the fragile structures that made civilian life worth protecting. Don't, Elena said, reading his face. Don't you dare sacrifice yourself to save me from consequences I chose when I stayed. Elena, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Her dark eyes blazed with something Frank had never seen before. Not fear, but fury. You think I haven't been waiting for this? You think I didn't know that loving a man with nightmares and no past meant this day would come? Another knock, harder this time. The choice isn't whether to protect me, Francis. The choice is whether you're going to walk out that door as Frank Castellano, or as the man who executed 63 civilians in a village that officially doesn't exist. The words hit him like bullets. Frank could feel Francis rising inside him, cold, efficient, capable of making the hard choices that kept operations clean. It would be easy to open the door, to slide back into the skin Webb had tailored for him in jungle training camps and classified briefing rooms. There's a third option, Frank said quietly. Elena's eyebrows raised in question. Neither Frank nor Francis walks out that door. Understanding dawned across her features. She stepped back, crossing herself quickly. No, absolutely not. It's clean. Webb doesn't get his weapon back. You don't get punished for loving the wrong man. And I don't get to choose. Elena's voice cut through his reasoning like a blade. You're doing it again, Francis. Making decisions for other people because you think you know what they can and can't handle. The front door creaked as someone tested the lock. Maybe that's who I really am, Frank said. Maybe I'm the man who decides who lives and dies, who stays and goes, who gets protected and who gets sacrificed. Maybe Webb's right. Maybe I never stopped being his best killer. Elena moved toward him then, closing the distance between them until he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could smell the lavender soap that had become the scent of Sunday mornings and safety. Or maybe, she whispered, you're the man who gets to choose who he becomes next. The lock clicked. The front door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Webb stepped into Elena's living room like he owned it, his silver hair catching the lamplight, his smile as patient as cancer. Behind him, two younger men in civilian clothes took positions that blocked the front windows and the hallway to the bedrooms. Hello, Francis, Webb said, his voice carrying 12 years of anticipation. Ready to come home? Frank stepped forward, placing himself between Elena and the three men, his body moving with muscle memory that predated his civilian life. Webb's smile widened, recognizing the shift in posture, the way Frank's hands positioned themselves for action. There he is, Webb said softly. I was beginning to think Francis had died in that Bangkok safe house after all. What do you want, Colonel? The military rank slipped out before Frank could stop it. Webb had been promoted since Cambodia, the massacre at Prey Nokor apparently a career enhancement rather than a liability. Senator Morrison is asking uncomfortable questions about Phoenix operations, specifically about villages that were supposed to be evacuated but somehow ended up as body counts. Webb's pale eyes never left Frank's face. The Cambodian government is being remarkably cooperative in sharing mass grave locations with international investigators. Elena's sharp intake of breath cut through the tension. Frank felt her hand brush against his back, a reminder of everything he stood to lose. Prey Nokor? Frank asked. Among others. But Prey Nokor is the one with surviving witnesses. The words hit Frank like shrapnel. Impossible. There were no survivors. Actually, there were. Webb pulled a manila folder from his jacket, spreading photographs across Elena's coffee table with the casual precision of a dealer arranging cards. Rice farmers working the paddies a mile east. They heard the helicopters, the gunfire. Curious people, farmers. They investigated after we left. Frank moved closer, his training overriding caution. The photographs showed excavated earth, scattered bones, fragments of fabric that might once have been children's clothing. Elena appeared beside him, her face draining of color as she saw the evidence of what 63 people became when Frank's false memories finally crumbled. They're testifying to Morrison's committee next month, Webb continued, describing American soldiers executing civilians. One farmer even sketched faces he remembered. Remarkably good artist for someone with a third-grade education. Webb produced another photograph, a pencil drawing of a young soldier with Frank's jawline, Frank's eyes, Frank's mouth giving orders while bodies fell behind him. The artist had captured something in the expression that made Frank's stomach clench. Not the face of a man following orders, but of someone who had found his calling. "You enjoyed it," Elena whispered, staring at the sketch. "Dear God, you actually enjoyed it." The words should have felt like accusations, but instead, they felt like remembering. Frank could suddenly recall the weight of his rifle, the clean efficiency of headshots, the way his pulse had steadied rather than quickened as the count climbed. He'd been good at killing, better than good. He'd been an artist. "The committee hearing is in 3 weeks, Webb said. "The farmers disappear before then, or everyone who was in that village becomes a liability, including the commanding officer who filed the after-action report claiming successful evacuation of friendly civilians." Frank understood. Webb had covered for him 12 years ago, had falsified records to protect them both. Now that protection had become a noose around both their necks. "What's the mission?" "Simple extraction. 3 targets, rural location, minimal security. You handle the farmers, I handle Morrison's committee files. Clean slate for everyone." Elena stepped back from both men, her hand clutching her saint's medal like armor. "You're talking about murdering the only people who can tell the truth about what you did." "We're talking about protecting national security," Webb replied smoothly, "about ensuring that classified operations remain classified." "No." The word came from Frank's mouth, but he wasn't sure which version of himself had spoken. "I won't kill witnesses to protect lies." Webb's expression didn't change, but something deadly shifted behind his eyes. "Francis, you seem to be confused about your position here. You're not a civilian stuntman with the luxury of moral choices. You're a special operations asset who disappeared from active duty without authorization. I'm legally dead. Death certificates can be amended, especially when fingerprints from a recent police investigation match a supposedly deceased soldier." Webb produced another photograph, Frank's booking photo from the bar fight 6 months ago, his fingerprints clear and catalogued. "Desertion during wartime carries interesting penalties, Francis, even 12 years after the fact." Elena moved toward the kitchen, her steps careful and deliberate. Frank could see her calculating distances, exits, weapons. The woman who sewed wedding dresses was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more practical. "But there's still the third option," Webb continued. "The one you were considering before I arrived. Very permanent, very final. Also very inconvenient for everyone you'd leave behind." Frank felt the trap closing around them. Webb had always been thorough, had always planned 3 moves ahead. He'd probably been watching Frank for months, cataloging relationships, identifying pressure points, waiting for the perfect moment to apply leverage. "What's your answer, Francis?" Webb asked. "Do you come home, or do I start making phone calls to immigration services?" Elena's voice cut through the moment like breaking glass. "Or maybe we give you what you really came for, Colonel." Webb's eyebrows raised fractionally, but his expression remained controlled. "I'm listening." Elena stepped back into the living room, no longer the frightened immigrant hiding in her kitchen. Her movements carried a different kind of precision now. Economical, purposeful. Frank recognized the shift because he'd felt it in himself moments before. "You didn't come here for Francis," she said calmly. "You came for the after-action reports. The ones he took when he disappeared." Frank's head snapped toward her. "Elena, what are you—" "The files that prove you ordered the executions at Prenocourt," Elena continued, her dark eyes locked on Webb. the ones that would destroy your career and put you in front of a firing squad if they ever surfaced. Webb's two men shifted positions slightly, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. But Webb himself remained perfectly still, calculating. Francis destroyed those files years ago, Webb said carefully. Did he? Elena moved to the mantelpiece, her fingers tracing the edge of a framed photograph of her grandmother, a man who spent 12 years building a false identity, who kept fake papers and emergency cash hidden throughout Los Angeles. You really think he wouldn't keep insurance? Frank stared at her, understanding flooding through him like cold water. She'd known. Somehow, through 18 months of sharing his bed and his nightmares, she'd known exactly what he was carrying. Show him, Elena said quietly. Frank's hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding him to the loose floorboard beneath Elena's china cabinet. His fingers found the waterproof case he'd hidden there during their second week together, when trust was new but paranoia was older. Inside, photographs of Webb's handwritten orders, copies of classified communications, radio transcripts that detailed the systematic execution of civilians, and Webb's signature on documents authorizing the cover-up. Webb's face didn't change, but Frank could see the calculation behind his eyes shifting. The mission parameters had just altered dramatically. Impressive, Webb said finally. But you're assuming I need those files more than I need Francis. Actually, Elena said, I'm assuming you need Francis to disappear permanently, along with anyone who might have seen those files. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. Webb hadn't come to recruit Frank back. He'd come to eliminate the last living witness to Prey No Core. The job offer, the threats about immigration, even the farmer's testimony, all theater designed to get Webb close enough for a clean kill. You're going to murder us both anyway, Frank said. The farmer's testimony is fabricated, Elena added. Probably your people, feeding the committee false information to justify hunting down the real witnesses. Webb's smile returned, colder now. Very good. Though you're missing one detail, which is, the bar fight 6 months ago wasn't random. My men have been monitoring Francis for 2 years, waiting for him to build something worth destroying. The arrest, the fingerprints, all orchestrated to establish legal grounds for bringing him back into custody. Frank felt the walls of the trap closing tighter. Even his attempts at normal life had been manipulated, used against him. So what happens now? Elena asked. You kill us, destroy the files, and Francis Castellano disappears forever? Home invasion, Webb said matter-of-factly. Drug dealers probably. Wrong address. Very tragic. The neighbors will remember how quiet and normal you both seemed. Frank's hand moved toward the hidden knife Elena kept behind the picture frame, the one she thought he didn't know about. But Webb's men were already moving, flanking positions that eliminated escape routes. Then Elena did something unexpected. She laughed. You really don't understand women, do you, Colonel? Before Webb could respond, Elena's hand found the small tape recorder hidden behind her grandmother's photograph. The device that had been running since Webb first walked through the door. Miguel wasn't my cousin, she said calmly. He was my handler, DEEA. I've been documenting Francis for 18 months, waiting for you to surface. The room exploded into motion. Webb's men drew weapons as Frank lunged for the nearest cover. Elena dove behind the couch, her hand emerging with a service pistol Frank had never seen before. Federal agents, Elena shouted, and suddenly the windows erupted with tactical lights. Drop your weapons! In the chaos that followed, Frank found himself laughing, the sound harsh and broken in his throat. After 12 years of running, after building and destroying identities, after falling in love with what he thought was another broken soul hiding from the past, he'd walked into the most perfect trap ever constructed. The woman who had loved him back to something approaching human had been hunting him all along. As Webb's blood pooled across Elena's grandmother's rug, as sirens wailed in the distance, Frank closed his eyes and finally stopped running. The man who had been Francis Castellano was dead. Frank Castellano had been an illusion. What walked out of that house in handcuffs was someone else entirely, someone who would spend the rest of his life learning to live with the weight of 63 graves and the memory of 18 months when love had felt real enough to believe in, even if it had all been performance.